The blizzard had been howling for 3 days straight when Daniel Pritchard stumbled through waist-deep snow toward the only cabin in Silverpine Gulch, still showing light through its window. Inside, Jacob Mercer sat comfortably by a modest fire, while every other prospector in the settlement burned their furniture just to survive until dawn. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival ingenuity speak to you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The temperature outside Jacob Mercer's cabin had reached 40 below zero, and the wind screamed through Silverpine Gulch with enough force to knock a man off his feet. It was January 18th, 1869, and the blizzard that had begun 3 mornings earlier showed no signs of ending. Snow had drifted to the rooflines of most cabins in the small prospecting settlement tucked into the Colorado mountains. Inside his cabin, Jacob sat at his handmade table wearing only a wool shirt, feeding another modest log into his fireplace. The interior temperature held steady near 60 degrees, comfortable enough that he had rolled up his sleeves while working on his accounts. A desperate pounding rattled his door. Jacob crossed the 15-foot cabin in 4 strides and lifted the heavy wooden beam that secured the entrance. Daniel Pritchard nearly fell through the doorway, his beard coated in ice, his face red and raw from exposure. He had walked less than 80 yards from his own cabin, but the journey had nearly killed him. Jacob pulled him inside and secured the door against the wind that tried to force its way in. Daniel stood shaking in the small entryway, his eyes adjusting to the warm interior. He looked around in disbelief. The cabin was genuinely warm, not the desperate, temporary warmth of a roaring fire that would fade the moment fuel ran low, but steady, comfortable heat that filled every corner of the space. Daniel's own cabin, like every other structure in Silverpine Gulch, had become a death trap over the past 3 days. He had burned everything he could spare. Extra furniture, wooden crates, even the handles of broken tools had gone into his fireplace. The fire roared constantly, consuming wood at a rate that would leave him with nothing by tomorrow. Yet his cabin remained brutally cold. Ice formed on the interior walls. His water bucket froze solid 18 inches from the hearth. He had wrapped himself in every blanket and hide he owned, and still shivered uncontrollably through the nights. When dawn broke on the 3rd day, and he saw smoke rising from Jacob's chimney in the same modest quantity as always, he had made the dangerous decision to seek refuge. Jacob handed him a tin cup of coffee that had been staying warm on the hearth. Daniel wrapped both hands around it, absorbing the heat through his frozen fingers. He looked at the fireplace. A small fire burned there, no larger than what a man might use for cooking, yet the entire cabin radiated warmth. He looked at the walls, the ceiling, the door he had just entered. Everything appeared solid, tight, deliberately constructed. This was not luck, this was engineering. 6 months earlier, this cabin had not existed. Jacob Mercer had lived in a standard prospector shelter, hastily built and barely adequate. What changed between then and now? What drove Jacob to spend an entire summer building this fortress against cold began with tragedy on a frozen February morning. The story of how one man's obsession with survival created a cabin that could withstand anything the Rocky Mountain winter could deliver starts not with innovation, but with death. The year 1868 began with unusual warmth in the Colorado high country. January and early February brought mild temperatures that lulled the prospectors of Silverpine Gulch into complacency. Men worked their claims in shirt sleeves during midday. Creek ice remained thin enough to break easily for water. Veterans of mountain winters remarked that they had never seen such gentle conditions. Then, on February 12th, the temperature collapsed. The cold front arrived without warning during the night. Jacob Mercer woke before dawn on February 13th to find frost coating the interior walls of the cabin he shared with his partner, Charles Brennan. The temperature had dropped 50 degrees in 6 hours. Outside, the world had transformed into a landscape of brutal cold. Trees cracked with sounds like rifle shots as sap froze and expanded. The creek that had been flowing the previous evening was now solid ice. The air itself seemed hostile, burning lungs with each breath. Charles had not risen with Jacob. His partner lay motionless in his bedroll on the opposite side of their small cabin. Jacob called his name twice before crossing the dirt floor to shake his shoulder. Charles Brennan was frozen solid. He had died sometime during the night, while sleeping less than 8 feet from a fireplace that still contained warm coals from the evening fire. Jacob pulled back the blankets and found his partner's body rigid, his skin gray, his eyes half open. There was no violence, no struggle. Charles had simply stopped generating enough heat to survive, and the cabin had offered no protection against the cold that seeped through every gap and crack in its construction. Jacob stood in the frozen cabin, looking at his partner's body, understanding with sudden clarity that the fire had not failed. Charles had kept the fire burning as long as he remained conscious. The coals proved that. What had failed was the structure itself. The cabin they had built the previous spring using standard prospecting camp methods was nothing more than a loose stack of logs with gaps wide enough to pass a finger through. Wind drove through the walls. Cold radiated down from the bark and pole roof. The notched corners where logs met created channels that funneled freezing air directly into the interior. No fire, regardless of size, could heat a space that leaked warmth as fast as flame could generate it. Jacob spent that morning wrapping Charles in canvas and carrying his body to the hillside above the settlement where frozen ground made burial impossible. He piled stones over the wrapped form to protect it from scavengers and marked the location with a wooden cross hewn from a pine branch. 4 other prospectors joined him on the hillside. 2 more men had died during the night in their cabins. A third had lost 3 fingers and both ears to frostbite despite never leaving his shelter. The cold snap had turned every cabin in Silver Pine Gulch into a trap that offered the illusion of protection while providing almost none. The temperature remained below zero for 8 consecutive days. Men burned everything combustible. They wore every piece of clothing they owned. They survived barely, but the experience changed something fundamental in Jacob Mercer's understanding of frontier shelter. On the 9th day, when the cold finally broke and temperatures climbed back above freezing, Jacob began studying failure with the intensity of a man who had seen death come for his partner while both of them believed they were safe. Jacob buried Charles Brennan properly once the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel. He worked alone on the hillside, digging through rock and frozen earth, refusing help from other prospectors who offered. The physical labor gave him time to think. By the time he lowered his partner's canvas-wrapped body into the ground and covered it with Colorado soil, Jacob had committed himself to understanding exactly why frontier cabins failed to protect the men who built them. He began with his own shelter. The cabin he and Charles had constructed measured 12 feet by 14 feet, built in the standard method that thousands of prospectors used across the Western Territories. They had selected trees, felled them, trimmed branches, and dragged logs to their chosen site. The logs were notched at corners using the simplest saddle joint pattern, stacked with bark still attached, and chinked with whatever mud and moss they could gather from the creek bank. The entire structure had taken them 5 days to complete. It kept rain off their heads and provided a place to sleep. That had seemed sufficient. Jacob spent a week examining every aspect of the construction, measuring gaps, noting weaknesses, understanding failure points. The bark on the logs created irregular surfaces that prevented tight fitting. Even where logs appeared to touch, gaps of half an inch or more existed between them. The mud chinking had dried and cracked, falling out in sections, leaving openings that wind exploited. The notched corners were worse. The saddle joints created structural weakness where each log rested on the one below in a pattern that allowed movement. When wind hit the cabin walls, the entire structure flexed slightly, and those corner joints opened and closed, pumping cold air into the interior with each gust. The roof was perhaps the greatest failure point. Jacob and Charles had laid poles across the top wall logs, covered those poles with bark sheets, and packed everything with soil and dried grass. The construction was waterproof enough for summer rain, but it offered almost no insulation against cold. Heat rose naturally, and the thin roof barrier allowed it to escape as fast as the fireplace could generate it. Jacob climbed onto his roof and lay flat, feeling with his hands. He could identify every pole position by temperature difference. Heat bled through the entire surface. He expanded his study to other cabins in Silverpine Gulch. The settlement held 19 structures, all built using variations of the same basic method. Jacob visited each one, asking questions, examining construction, noting which cabins had failed most dramatically during the cold snap. A pattern emerged. The cabins that had kept men alive were not those with the largest fireplaces or the most fuel. They were cabins where builders had accidentally reduced the number of gaps. One prospector had built using logs that were unusually straight and uniform. Another had positioned his structure protected from prevailing winds by rock outcropping. These men had survived more comfortably because their shelters leaked less heat. Jacob's observations became obsessive. He walked through the settlement in early morning, watching steam rise from cabin roofs, seeing patterns of heat loss. Other prospectors noticed his behavior. Daniel Pritchard, a man who had been mining the gulch for 3 years, openly questioned Jacob's mental state. Grief did strange things to men in the mountains, and Jacob's fixation on cabin construction seemed like a mind-breaking under loss. Spring came to the Colorado mountains in late March of 1868, and with it came the opportunity to leave. Silverpine Gulch. Jacob had gold dust worth approximately $400 from the previous season's work, enough to justify the journey to Denver, where assayers paid fair prices and supplies could be purchased for the coming year. Most prospectors made this trip with celebration in mind, spending their earnings on whiskey, women, and temporary comfort before returning to the hardship of mountain life. Jacob had different priorities. The journey to Denver took 3 days on horseback, following game trails that descended through pine forests and eventually joined rough wagon roads. Jacob reached the city on April 2nd and immediately began a study that had nothing to do with gold or mining. He spent his first day walking through the commercial district, examining buildings with the same intensity he had applied to failed cabins. Denver was growing rapidly, transforming from a rough frontier town into something approaching civilization. Brick buildings were rising along the main streets, structures that would stand for decades. Jacob watched masons working on a bank building. He observed how they laid bricks in overlapping patterns, each brick spanning the joint between 2 bricks below it. The pattern created a wall where no single point of failure existed. Force applied to one brick was distributed across multiple connection points. He asked questions of the workers during their lunch break, learning how corners were reinforced, how the interlocking pattern created strength far greater than individual bricks possessed. He moved on to a warehouse district where a furrier was constructing a cold storage building. The structure's walls were double-layered with a gap between inner and outer surfaces. A worker explained that the gap would be packed with sawdust to create insulation. Rather than building thicker walls, the furrier was trapping dead air between barriers. Dead air, the worker explained, was one of the best insulators available. It could not conduct heat if it could not move. Jacob connected this to observations he had made about animal dens and beaver lodges. On his 3rd day in Denver, Jacob found a construction site where carpenters were framing a house. He watched them working on corner posts, seeing how they braced diagonal supports between vertical and horizontal members. The bracing prevented corners from shifting under pressure. One carpenter demonstrated by pushing on a partially framed wall. Without diagonal bracing, the wall flexed. With bracing installed, it became rigid. The difference was immediately applicable to log construction. Jacob purchased supplies that other prospectors would have considered wasteful. He bought 60 feet of heavy rope, a large canvas tarp, a specialized draw knife for shaping wood, and a set of auger bits in sizes larger than standard. He spent $18 on these items, money that could have bought a month's worth of food. At a hardware store, he examined iron brackets and hinges, studying designs carefully, understanding how metal reinforcement could strengthen wood construction. On April 7th, Jacob left Denver and began the return journey to Silverpine Gulch. His head was full of principles and techniques that had nothing to do with finding gold and everything to do with surviving the next winter. Other prospectors who passed him on the trail noticed his unusual supplies and made jokes about Mercer building a ship in the mountains. Jacob ignored them. He was carrying knowledge back to the high country that would change everything. Jacob returned to Silverpine Gulch in mid-April of 1868 and immediately began dismantling the cabin where Charles Brennan had died. Other prospectors watched with confusion as he pulled apart a structure that was perfectly functional by frontier standards. The logs were sound, the roof intact, the fireplace operational. He salvaged every log that met his standards for straightness and diameter, rejecting any piece showing significant taper or irregular shape. Nearly half the original cabin logs were discarded. He selected a new building site on higher ground, 50 yards from the creek on a slight rise with clear sight lines in all directions. Most prospectors built near water for convenience. Jacob understood that visibility and drainage mattered more than saving steps to fill a water bucket. The location offered natural wind protection from a rock formation to the northwest while allowing southern sun exposure. He spent 2 days clearing the site and digging a shallow trench around the cabin's perimeter, filling it with rocks to create a level foundation that would prevent settling. The real work began with timber selection. Jacob spent 3 weeks in the surrounding forest, not mining, but choosing trees. He wanted logs as uniform as possible, approximately 12 inches in diameter, with minimal taper and straight grain. He felled each tree carefully, limbed it completely, and used his new draw knife to strip every inch of bark. The process was brutally time-consuming. Each log required hours of work. Other prospectors used whatever trees were convenient and left the bark on because it was faster. Jacob understood that bark created gaps and irregular surfaces that prevented tight fitting. When he finally began construction in early May, Daniel Pritchard and 2 other prospectors came to watch. They expected standard notched corner construction. Instead, Jacob laid his first logs extending 2 feet past each corner, creating crossed extensions that looked wasteful and strange. Pritchard spoke what others were thinking. "You are wasting 2 feet of log on every corner, Mercer. That is 8 feet of timber on every course." Jacob said nothing, continuing his work. He was building corners that would not flex, that would not create the pumping action that had killed his partner. The extended corners required a different joining method. Jacob used his large auger bits to drill holes through the overlapping log sections, then drove wooden pins through multiple logs simultaneously, locking them together in a rigid pattern. The result looked unusual, with log ends protruding past corners, but the structure was solid in a way that notched construction could never achieve. Each corner became a single integrated unit rather than a stack of individual pieces. Progress was painfully slow. Where an experienced prospector could build a standard cabin in 4 or 5 days, Jacob spent 2 weeks just completing the foundation and first 3 courses of logs. His obsessive attention to detail, his constant measuring and adjusting, his rejection of any log that did not fit perfectly, all of it reinforced the growing consensus in Silverpine Gulch that Charles Brennan's death had broken something in Jacob Mercer's mind. Men did not spend this much time on shelter. They built quickly and moved on to the work that actually mattered, finding gold. Jacob worked alone, through May and into June, methodical and silent, building something the others could not yet understand. Jacob fitted each log with the care of a craftsman building furniture rather than a prospector throwing up shelter. He would position a log on the wall, mark where it made contact with the log below, then remove it and use his draw knife to shape the contact surface. The goal was to eliminate gaps, to create wood-to-wood contact along the entire length of each log. The process required patience that bordered on madness by frontier standards. A single log might take an entire day to fit properly. Between each course of logs, Jacob applied his chinking mixture. He had spent 3 days in late May preparing the material, digging clay from the creek bank, boiling down pine resin collected from scarred trees, and mixing in hair from elk hides. The result was a paste that remained pliable during application, but hardened into something far superior to standard mud chinking. The pine resin made it waterproof and gave it adhesive properties that bonded to the wood. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing the cracking that plagued normal chinking. Jacob packed the mixture into every gap with his fingers, building up layers, ensuring no air could pass between logs. The window placement generated particular criticism from Daniel Pritchard and others who stopped by to watch. Jacob cut his window opening high on the south wall, 6 feet above the interior floor line. The opening measured only 10 inches wide by 12 inches tall, barely large enough to provide light. Pritchard questioned the logic directly. "A window is supposed to let you see out, not be a peephole." Jacob explained nothing, but his reasoning was clear to anyone who understood heat dynamics. Warm air rose. A high window lost less heat than a low one. A small window lost less heat than a large one. The window provided adequate light and ventilation while minimizing thermal loss. The door construction consumed 2 full weeks of work. Jacob selected the densest, straightest-grained wood he could find and shaped thick planks using his draw knife. Each plank measured nearly 3 inches thick, far heavier than necessary by normal standards. He fitted them together using tongue and groove joints he had observed on warehouse doors in Denver, creating a door that functioned as a single piece rather than separate boards held by cross-bracing. The finished door weighed close to 90 pounds, heavy enough that mounting it properly required careful hinge placement and frame reinforcement. By late June, the cabin walls stood complete at 7 feet tall, requiring 9 courses of logs to achieve that height. Jacob had been working for 7 weeks on a structure that should have taken less than 1 week to complete. Other prospectors had stopped offering commentary and simply shook their heads when passing his building site. The consensus was clear. Mercer had lost his mind to grief and was wasting the entire summer building a cabin that would function no better than anyone else's. Daniel Pritchard made this opinion known publicly at the settlement's small trading post, declaring that Jacob would realize his mistake when winter came and his elaborate cabin proved no warmer than a standard structure while having cost him an entire season of mining income. Jacob completed his cabin roof using the standard method of poles, bark, and packed earth in early July. The structure was already superior to anything else in Silverpine Gulch based on wall construction alone, but Jacob understood that the roof represented the primary heat loss point in any shelter. He had observed this in his studies, had felt it with his own hands, and had watched his partner die because heated air rose through inadequate roof barriers faster than any fire could replace it. The solution he envisioned would seem like insanity to every other prospector in the settlement. On July 8th, Jacob left camp before dawn and headed into the high country where elk spent their summers. He was not hunting for meat. He was hunting for a hide of specific size and quality. He spent 3 days tracking a herd before he found what he needed, a massive bull elk that would provide a hide large enough to cover his entire roof in a single piece. He took the animal with 1 clean shot, then spent 2 days processing the hide, carefully removing it without creating holes or tears that would compromise its function. Back at his cabin, Jacob spent a full week treating the hide. He scraped it clean, then rubbed it with a mixture of animal brain and oil, working the material until it became supple. He repeated this process daily, then began applying additional coats of pine oil to increase its waterproof properties. Other prospectors who saw him working with the hide assumed he was preparing it for sale or trade. Large elk hides commanded good prices, sometimes as much as $50 depending on quality and size. The idea that he might use it for construction purposes occurred to no one. On July 22nd, with the hide fully treated and several other prospectors watching out of curiosity, Jacob began the installation that would define his entire project. He had marked and drilled evenly spaced holes along the hide's edges approximately 18 inches apart, creating a pattern that would allow secure attachment. He climbed onto his completed roof and carefully draped the massive hide over the entire structure, positioning it so that it covered from ridgeline to eaves with slight overhang on all sides. Then he began driving stakes. He had prepared 20 hardwood stakes, each sharpened at one end and measuring approximately 4 feet in length. Working methodically, he drove each stake through the hide, through the bark and pole roof structure beneath, anchoring deep enough that the stakes penetrated into the top wall logs. The process took most of the day. When he finished, the hide was secured to the roof by 20 penetration points, stretched tight across the surface, creating a secondary barrier above the standard roof construction. Daniel Pritchard stood watching the final stakes go in, then spoke loud enough for the small crowd to hear. "You just ruined a $50 hide on your roof, Mercer." "That is the damnedest waste I have ever witnessed," others murmured agreement. Jacob sealed each stake penetration point with hot pine tar to prevent water entry, said nothing in response, and climbed down from his roof. The installation was complete, and explanations were pointless. Jacob moved into his completed cabin in early August of 1868. The interior measured 12 feet by 14 feet, identical in size to his previous shelter, but fundamentally different in every other aspect. The walls were solid, the gaps between logs minimal enough that candlelight could not pass through. The door sealed tightly against its frame. The small window high on the south wall provided adequate light while maintaining the thermal envelope he had worked so carefully to create. The hide-covered roof shed the occasional summer rain with complete effectiveness, water running off the sloped surface without penetrating to the interior. The first real test came in early October when temperatures dropped unexpectedly. The cold snap lasted 3 days, with nighttime temperatures falling to near 20 degrees. Jacob burned a normal amount of firewood, the same quantity he would have used in pleasant weather just for cooking and comfort. His cabin remained warm throughout. Other prospectors burned twice as much wood to maintain barely adequate interior temperatures. A few noticed the difference, but attributed it to luck or to the fact that Jacob's cabin was newly built and therefore naturally tighter than structures that had weathered multiple seasons. November brought the first heavy snow. Silver Pine Gulch received 14 inches over 2 days, and the accumulation on cabin roofs became a concern. Standard bark and pole roofs collected snow that added dangerous weight to structures. Several prospectors spent hours shoveling their roofs to prevent collapse. Jacob's hide-covered roof shed snow continuously. The steep angle and smooth surface of the stretched hide allowed accumulation to slide off naturally. By the time the storm ended, his roof carried less than an inch of snow, while others struggled under crushing weight. Daniel Pritchard's roof sagged visibly under the load, requiring emergency reinforcement from interior support posts. December brought sustained cold. Temperatures remained below freezing for weeks, and firewood consumption became a critical concern for everyone in the settlement. Men who had not stockpiled adequate fuel began burning furniture, tool handles, anything made of wood that was not absolutely essential. Jacob's firewood consumption remained consistent with what he had used in October. He burned 1 fire per day, modest in size, and his cabin maintained comfortable temperatures. The hide roof and carefully fitted walls created an insulated envelope that retained heat with remarkable efficiency. Other prospectors began paying attention. Daniel Pritchard visited Jacob's cabin in mid-December, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but actually to observe the interior conditions. He found Jacob working at his table in shirt sleeves, while outside temperatures hovered near zero. The cabin was genuinely warm, noticeably more comfortable than Pritchard's own shelter, where he wore multiple layers constantly and still shivered. Pritchard examined the walls, touched the chinking between logs, looked up at the ceiling, where the hide roof created a secondary barrier above the standard pole construction. He asked no questions but left understanding that he had badly misjudged Jacob's project. What had seemed like waste and insanity was actually engineering of a quality that frontier construction rarely achieved. The winter would prove just how superior that engineering was, but the early tests had already demonstrated that Jacob Mercer had solved the problem that killed his partner. The blizzard arrived on January 16, 1869, with a ferocity that veterans of mountain winters had never witnessed. The temperature plummeted to 40 below zero in the first 6 hours. Wind speeds reached levels that made standing upright impossible. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Every prospector in Silver Pine Gulch retreated to their cabins and prepared to wait out what they assumed would be a day, perhaps 2, of severe weather. The storm lasted 3 full days. By the end of the first day, every cabin in the settlement was struggling. Men burned firewood at maximum rates, feeding flames constantly, yet interior temperatures continued dropping. The wind found every gap in wall construction, every weakness in corner joints, every inadequate, chinking application. Cold air forced its way inside, while heated air escaped through roofs that offered minimal resistance. Fires roared in fireplaces, consuming wood that prospectors had assumed would last through February. But the heat generated was lost faster than it could warm the interior spaces. The second day brought desperation. Several prospectors abandoned their own cabins and crowded into the largest structure in the settlement, a building that housed the small trading post. 15 men packed into a space designed for half that number, feeding the fireplace everything burnable they could find. The collective body heat and massive fire kept the interior barely above freezing. Men wore every piece of clothing they owned. Breathing created ice crystals in beards. Water froze in cups sitting 3 feet from the hearth. They survived, but understood that if the storm continued into a third day, fuel would run out completely. Jacob Mercer sat alone in his cabin through all 3 days, comfortable enough that he never wore his heavy coat indoors. He maintained a single modest fire, burning wood at the same rate he used during normal winter weather. The hide roof prevented heat from escaping upward. The carefully fitted walls with their superior chinking eliminated drafts. The extended corners created structural rigidity that prevented the flexing and pumping action that plagued notched construction. The small, high window minimized heat loss through openings. Every element of his design worked together to create a thermal envelope that retained warmth with remarkable efficiency. On the third day, with conditions in the trading post becoming critical, Daniel Pritchard made the decision to seek refuge with Jacob. The journey of 80 yards nearly killed him. Wind knocked him down twice. The cold burned his exposed skin. Ice formed in his lungs with each breath. When he pounded on Jacob's door and stumbled inside, the contrast was so extreme that he stood motionless for a full minute, simply absorbing the reality of the warm interior. Jacob's fire was small, no larger than what a man might use for cooking. Yet the cabin was genuinely comfortable, warmer than any structure Pritchard had experienced during the 3-day storm. Pritchard asked the question that had been building since October: how is this possible? Jacob explained the complete system for the first time, describing each element, each principle, each decision that had seemed wasteful or insane to observers. Pritchard understood finally that he was standing inside engineering that had solved the problem of frontier winter survival. The blizzard ended on January 19, 1869, leaving Silverpine Gulch buried under 4 feet of snow and a settlement forever changed. 2 prospectors had died from hypothermia despite being inside their cabins with fires burning. 3 others suffered severe frostbite that would cost them fingers or toes once the tissue damage became apparent. The survivors emerged from their shelters, understanding that standard frontier construction was inadequate for the reality of Rocky Mountain winters. Jacob Mercer's cabin had stood as proof that better methods existed. Daniel Pritchard was the first to rebuild. He approached Jacob in late January and asked directly for instruction on the hide roof system and wall construction techniques. Jacob shared everything freely, explaining the extended corner method, demonstrating proper log fitting, describing the chinking mixture recipe, and detailing the hide preparation and installation process. He helped Pritchard through the construction that spring, correcting mistakes, suggesting improvements, ensuring the finished cabin would function as intended. By May of 1869, Pritchard had a structure that matched Jacob's design principles. 3 more prospectors rebuilt their cabins that summer using variations of Jacob's methods. Not everyone adopted the complete system. Hide roofs were expensive, requiring either successful hunting or significant cash outlay. But the wall construction techniques, the extended corners, the superior chinking, and the attention to thermal envelope integrity spread quickly through the mining camps of Colorado. Men who visited Silverpine Gulch saw the cabins with hide roofs and distinctive protruding corner logs. They asked questions, learned principles, and carried the knowledge to other settlements. By 1871, what miners and prospectors called Mercer-style cabins could be found across the Colorado high country. The name stuck even though Jacob never claimed credit or attempted to profit from his innovation. He continued prospecting through 1872, found modest success, and saved enough money to leave the mountains. In 1873, he moved to Boulder and opened a small carpentry shop where he built furniture and occasionally contracted for house construction. He never married, lived quietly, and rarely spoke of his years in the mining camps. Jacob Mercer died in 1891 at age 58 from pneumonia. He was buried in Boulder's Columbia Cemetery under a simple granite marker that listed his name, birth year, death year, and nothing more. His carpentry shop was sold to pay debts. He left behind no children, no written records, no formal documentation of the techniques he had developed. But in the mountains where he had lived and worked, his legacy remained built into structures that still stood decades after his death. Photographs from the 1880s show mining camps throughout Colorado where multiple cabins display the distinctive features of Mercer's design. Hide-covered roofs, extended corner logs, carefully fitted walls. These structures protected new generations of miners, hunters, and settlers from the same winter conditions that had killed Charles Brennan. The innovation born from tragedy and refined through obsessive attention to engineering principles had become standard practice, spreading organically because it solved real problems. Jacob had built something that outlasted him, not through fame or recognition, but through simple functionality that others recognized and adopted. The frontier remembered not through monuments or plaques, but through the shelter that kept men alive.